Hey everybody, it's Will Steely here with GSG. I'm standing next to Lee Manovich from HP, and he's going to educate us on how white ink is different on the HP Latex platforms, specifically with the R series and the new 700, 800s. Lee?
So there's a few new features that are on the HP Latex with respect to white in comparison to traditional white is done with UV or maybe solvent ink. So let's start with just a couple of the main differences between them. First of all, if you look at all of our inks over here, you see that all of them except for the white have only one connector, but our white down here has two connectors. So the reason for that, we recognize everybody industry-wide, the pigment that they use for white ink is a titanium based, it's very heavy, and it drops out of suspension very quickly. It settles to the bottom. And so one of the challenges that everybody has is how we keep that pigment floating inside there. A lot of people will agitate the box, some people will pull from the bottom and dump to the top so it's constantly circulating, but we go one step further. So inside our boxes of ink for white, we actually have two separate bags. One is full, one is empty. And what happens periodically is that we take all of the full bag of ink, we run it all the way through the printer to the printhead, back through a second line over to the empty bag. So what happens is we're essentially doing this, right, dumping from bucket to bucket all the time, all the way through the system so that even at the head, we don't have any settling. So that's one of the major innovations that we have. We call it macro recirculation, and it's unique to this machine, and it's fantastic. When pandemic started, it was 104 days between when I last printed white ink and when I was able to get back into my lab for the very first time in print. All I did was take my heads out, and I'm going to talk about that next, replaced my print heads, fired the machine up, and the very first print that came off of there looked just as good as the day that that printer installed. I'm not saying ignore your machine for 104 days, but if you have to, I can tell you it'll probably work just fine. The other thing that we do with our white ink that's really different, I alluded to a little bit. So we call this white on demand. On our carriage, we have 8 heads. We have 2 heads that are white. When I'm not actively printing white, I can actually remove those print heads and replace them with just what we call a recirculation print head. Recirculation print head just tells the machine that the white heads aren't actually in place, and it connects my 2 ink lines so that that macro recirculation happens even with my white heads out. Where my white heads go are inside what we call an offline rotation chamber. It's just a sealed box that periodically rotates so that ink doesn't settle even inside the print head when it's not in use. It allows us in really just a couple of minutes. During demos, sometimes I do this truly while holding my breath just to prove that it can be done. They sit inside that box, and then just a couple of minutes later, I am ready to print white ink. That means that I don't have waste, and it means that my print heads are always fresh and ready to go. Now, the other thing that makes white ink really unique to this machine, and this is something that's really special about latex with respect to UV. Everybody in the UV space, and that includes HP ourselves, everybody in the UV space, in order to make our ink turn from liquid to solid, which is what happens in UV, we need to use a chemical called a photo initiator. The photo initiator that we use is yellow in color. Okay? Now when I'm working with cyan, magenta, yellow, black, I can overcome that yellow tint. But when I'm working with white, obviously I can't. Okay? And we don't want yellow white ink. So what everybody does is they put a blue dye into the ink. It's what we refer to as optical brighteners. You might have heard of that before. You might even see it on copy paper. They talk about optical brighteners. Because it's dye, over time it breaks down in UV light. If I think about taking a bright white piece of paper and leaving it outside in the sun, especially I'm here in Texas today where it's like 12,000 degrees, if I leave it out in the sun for even a couple of days, I'll see that it starts to turn yellow because the dye is disappearing and it's leaving the true color of the ink, or in this case the paper, which is yellow. With latex, we use a different curing system that doesn't use photo initiators. Because we don't use photo initiators, we don't use optical brightener, and that means that our white ink stays white pretty much forever. I can't say forever, but we've done some long-term weather testing, and in 3 years of testing, you don't really see an appreciable difference in the white at all. So that's really as concisely as I can put it, some of the big innovations that we have for white ink on the latex printer. And again, that's not only on the R series, but also on the 700 and 800 printers as well, our roll-to-roll printers.
Wow, thanks so much, Lee. That's very useful information. And if you want to learn a little bit more, come to gogsg.com.